Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Again, find out more about us at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy on our website, virginiainstitute.org. And you go to YouTube and find archives of all these programs of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Go to youtube.com and search Freedom and Prosperity Radio. Our next guest is president of Bolster the Blue. You find them online at bolstertheblue.com. Brenda Tillet. Brenda, welcome to the program. How are you doing this weekend?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Well, thank you for doing what you do, flying in the face of such a stiff headwind of popular disapproval of law enforcement, and thank you for standing up. What was the moment you said you needed to step forward and start a grassroots campaign to support our law enforcement here in the Commonwealth?
Well, it's interesting, Joe, how Bolster the Blue was actually formed. As I watched with horror, as so many families have across the country, and I've seen our law enforcement officers be assaulted, I've seen them verbally and physically abused, and then recently we've seen assassinations escalating across the country, I knew that I had to do something. And so my son and I were in a parking lot. We saw a law enforcement officer. We approached him and just wanted to express how much we care about officers and how we pray for them, and asked if there was anything we could do to show that support. So from that conversation, the next day, we took catered lunch to our local station, and several of the officers talked with us about standing in the gap for them at a Board of Supervisors meeting and speaking out against ending qualified immunity, which, as you know, was being considered by our Senate and our House of Delegates here in Virginia several months ago. So from that one act of kindness, an entire movement was formed that has now opened my eyes to not only the assault on police officers and legislation from a state level and also, a nationwide level, but that battle is being waged in our own backyard, in our counties, and in our local and city government.
It was one of the most frightening things in the nuance of the way the bills were written. A police officer could be fired for pretty much anything because instead of specifically targeting things that would be considered a violation of somebody's civil rights, they said something as ambiguous as for a violation of protocols and standards, which could be your sideburns were too long or your shirt was untucked. It was crazy making to think, that then they would turn around and, then try to tell the citizens in their community they just can't get law enforcement people. So that's why crime's on the rise?
Yeah, and what's so absurd about this is a lot of people don't understand, Joe, what ending qualified immunity actually means or what qualified immunity even is. Mm-hmm. There are already laws in place that protect civilians against criminal activity by law enforcement officers. So that's already in place. What we're looking at is an overall nationwide assault through the guise of the name progressive reform to try to dismantle the system of law and order and safety that we have in our communities by perpetrating or putting forward this narrative that's simply not true. So when you look at allowing individuals to file civil lawsuits against law enforcement officers, you're basically placing that officer and his family at financial risk for having their entire dream, their American dream, their finances, their savings, their 401k, their pension, everything stripped from them. And that already actually exists in our law that we have today. And what we found at Bolster the Blue by standing in the gap for officers and building relationships with them and having more and more of them come forward and talk to us is that there will be a mass exodus from law enforcement like we have never witnessed in our lives if that is actually taken from them. And we know that in January, our House of Delegates and our Senate is already working feverishly right now to revive that bill, to look at it again. And also they're going to be looking at defelonizing assault on police officers, which was also killed this fall, and also this look at defunding the police. So we're preparing to wage war in all three of those battles.
When you talk about this, I feel like there's two parts to this, Brenda, because, and we're talking with Brenda Tillet, president of Bolster the Blue, you have to go back a year and a half when Michael Bloomberg and George Soros funded campaigns to flip even Democrat Commonwealth's attorneys in Virginia to load their offices with people who believe in a concept called survival crime, where they'd use their prosecutorial judgments to not prosecute people for theft and for property crimes and things like that if they were just doing it to survive. And I don't know how you can make something more ambiguous than that. But when you couple the defund the police movement with these survival crime believing prosecutors, you're really looking at an assault on private property ownership.
And I'm so glad you asked me about that, because our Commonwealth attorney in Fairfax County, Commonwealth Attorney Toscano, was paid for by George Soros last year. Soros contributed $1.1 million to his campaign, and he has been on a mission since last year to implement progressive reform measures such as the ones you just described. And if we look at a study that was recently done by the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, which your listeners can view on bolstertheblue.com, we've looked at 6 other cities in the country where Soros funded these ultra-liberal attorneys and put them in place of attorneys who already existed, who, as you described, were liberal, just to put forward this progressive agenda. And what we've seen is an increase in felonies and just massive destruction and horrible consequences. Some of the cities cited are Baltimore, Philadelphia, Chicago, and the list goes on and on. Mm-hmm. And that's what the future will look like for Fairfax County. And just one really significant point is part of Commonwealth Attorney Toscano's agenda has been to pick and choose, as you mentioned, the cases that he'll prosecute and the lives that he'll defend. An officer just recently told me that a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old child who were violently abused by their father were recently left to fend for themselves in court with no attorney showing up to prosecute that case. We also know recently there was a case involving an assault of a police officer where the officer showed up to court that day and was told by the clerk that the case had been pled out by the Commonwealth attorney, and that officer had never even been contacted, which violates law. And the list of those types of instances just goes on and on, where he's determining who he's going to protect and who he's not. And these are not my words. This is information that I'm receiving, having built relationships with law enforcement officers through our constant advocacy for them over the past 4 months.
Find them again. It's bolstertheblue.com. Brenda, thank you so much for sanctified work that you're doing there. And to remind people, this began with the most disingenuous behavior, starting in Ferguson and going on out, of elected officials who will point to law enforcement and say, I don't know what they're doing there, when they're actually just enforcing the laws that the legislators put into place. So if anything, people should be mad at the legislators, not the law enforcement officers.
Absolutely. It has to start with the people you put into office. And I think, unfortunately, not just in Virginia, but across America, people are asleep at the wheel. And I keep saying, wake up, Virginia. Look at who you're putting into office as your Board of Supervisors, as your county attorneys. Look at who your House of Delegates are. Don't just look to the presidency and who your congressmen and women are. Look on a local level, because these individuals wield a great deal of power, not only in terms of laws that your officers have to follow, but how those officers are going to be protected. And if they're not protected, rest assured they will find other jobs they can do in our communities. I know in Fairfax County we've had a mass exodus already of our law enforcement officers, and all 8 of our stations are low on officers because of the way they felt persecuted, and also because of the actions of our recent chief of police. And one of the huge successes of Bolster the Blue was the pressure campaign that we applied over the past several months to the Board of Supervisors that just resulted in his resignation in February of next year. That was a huge testament to the power that grassroots conservative voices have if we will just stand up, not be afraid, be bold, and voice your opinions and your concerns to the people you have elected or others have elected for you who sit in positions of power. You have to be consistent and you have to be constant. And we've already had individuals reach out to us from other areas of the country, including Philadelphia, to try to replicate what we're doing here in Fairfax County. And we're going to continue to do that and spread the word and encourage people to stand up and no longer be silent. And if people want to get involved with our movement or learn how to do this in their areas, they only need to go to bolstertheblue.com to sign up for our newsletter or send us an email and inquire about what you can do to get involved.
And really, this is an issue that should be targeting the poor community first, because if you have a car that you rely on to get to and from work and somebody steals it, you're now out of work. You're now out of your money to pay your bills. You can't just replace the car. This isn't about protecting rich people. This is about protecting the working poor and the middle class, because they can't afford to replace property that might be stolen in a world where law enforcement has become so sclerotic because of the actions of these boards of supervisors and the General Assembly.
And we know in Fairfax County, to that point, Joe, auto theft has increased significantly over the past several months because our officers are not proactively policing. Mm-hmm. They're disengaging, and they're only getting involved when they have to, because as I mentioned, our chief of police did not support them, and our Commonwealth attorney Toscano is actively pursuing, investigating past cases, looking into body cam images, and trying to find ways that he can potentially file suits against our officers. And that's information that's been shared with me from officers. That's not my own personal information. Mm-hmm. So we know that violent crime has increased significantly, including murders and assaults, even over the past week. I just had a conversation with someone in leadership in law enforcement yesterday, and this individual mentioned to me that there has been a huge increase such that it is very alarming to officers in the county. And this is only going to continue to get worse and worse because, as you mentioned earlier, attorneys such as Toscano look at cases of theft and they raise that bar even higher before they'll get involved. I've heard in Fairfax County right now that our attorney is looking at cases only where theft involves $1,500 or more. Now, I don't know what that actual legal bar has been set at, but that's what I've heard. That's what I've heard. Mm-hmm. So if you look at a small business owner, and that business owner knows that anyone who steals from them an amount that's less than $1,500 isn't going to be prosecuted, what does that do to our small businesses?
Well, it shuts them down. I mean, I would say, well, I'm out of town. I'll either sell online, and this costs jobs on top of it, because then the business owners leave, and then you have a derelict downtown, which then drives more businesses out of. Brenda, you brought up something just a few moments ago I want to circle back to. The importance of boards of supervisors in this process. And I don't know if you share my frustration frequently, and everyone has a right to run for whatever, and anyone that wants to speak about conservative principles and run for office is great by me. But, so frequently we'll find 5 to 7 people all vying for the same congressional seat or a Senate seat, but I can't get anyone to run for the Board of Supervisors, it seems. It's so frustrating to point to people and say, do you realize how important these board seats are? And we're leaving them to leftists in some cases and leftist socialists in others.
And that's a real problem we have in the state of Virginia specifically. We left many seats uncontested in our state legislature the last election, but even on a local level, to your point regarding the Board of Supervisors, we have a lot of people who just don't see the point, because right now our Board of Supervisors is 9-1 Democrat to Republican. Wow. So we don't have a lot of support. We don't have a lot of people voicing or standing beside us. Supervisor Harity has been a real advocate of law enforcement, and some of the other board members are coming over to our side, but a lot of them do support this progressive reform. So I think individuals like me in the community who haven't had any direction, haven't felt the strength or power of our voice, have just needed someone else to stand up, take that one step, put one foot forward, speak out in public, and say, I stand with you and I stand with law enforcement. And it's amazing how many people have contacted me and said, Brenda, because Bolster the Blue stood up and spoke out for law enforcement, you made me brave. I was willing to stand up and speak at the community input meeting. I was willing to come to a rally and protest for law enforcement officers. I was willing to approach an officer and give them a thank you card and tell them that I appreciate them. So it just takes one small gesture, and then from that, we'll be able to identify those people that you're talking about who are able to be even bolder, who are the great public speakers, the people who are able to voice conservative values in a way that is motivating and compelling to voters, and that's how we win.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you have a willing ally right here with me because you really, truth be told, I feel like we've got our political system on its head when we look to Washington, D.C. for everything, when it really should be the legislations that are the closest to us. And sometimes it just takes two. You have one person to present a proposal and then a second, and then that gets it on the discussion floor. And that's where you see, some folks who are not as committed to the progressive reparational agenda that leaves our law enforcement in the dust, because then they actually have to take a vote on it as opposed to just denying that it even happens or passing it over, deeming it.
And the Board of Supervisors often will only hear one side of the story because they don't have that close connection with officers or with members of the community. And a lot of times the community members are not even aware of what's being talked about in a Board of Supervisors meeting.
True.
And so one such example of that is our Commonwealth Attorney Descano just recently asked for $19.1 million to fund 137 more anti-law enforcement attorneys. His office currently is about 40 members. And so when he brought this forward, I started doing a little bit more investigation into what are the potential needs, how does law enforcement view this. And what I found was so surprising, Joe. I talked to numerous officers who told me he's asking for money, yet we bring numerous cases forward that are not even contested, such as an expired license, expired registration, tinted windows. And he throws them out when we show up to court. One officer told me he showed up and 30 of his cases had been dismissed. So my question I'm proposing on December 1st at the next Board of Supervisors meeting is, why aren't we looking into the justification for this and what that money actually looks like? What is the accountability here, and how much money is he costing us that's basically easy money for our county for you to use in our schools or other areas that benefit the community? So if he's going to ask for $19.1 million, let's look at where the waste might be in other areas and why aren't these cases being handled. And no attorney even needs to show up to those cases, Joe. And most of the time, the people who've received the ticket don't even dispute them because they know it's not disputable. Either your tags were registered and current or they weren't. And so that's another really big issue. But the list just goes on and on and on, and people aren't aware. People are not informed. Another issue is a police reform suggestions matrix right now that folks can look at on our website at bolstertheblue.com that the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors is looking at to implement progressive reform in Fairfax County. Most of the suggestions on that matrix come from external interest groups. So it's from the ACLU, it's from the NAACP, it's from people who do not represent families in Fairfax County. And so citizens can contribute to that matrix, but most members of the community don't even know it exists. It's a real problem.
Well, and that's why we wanted to highlight your website and hope that more people across the Commonwealth touch base with you, start up their own Bolster the Blue campaign across the Commonwealth and beyond. Certainly, if the message is getting into Philadelphia and places like that, it is something that we have to understand that sure, nobody likes to get arrested. Nobody wants to hear about a family member getting arrested. But so frequently, and we saw this happen here in Charlottesville, where our flagship station is. They started a civilian police review board, and their first demand was to see data on what they called stop and frisk incidents, which turned out to be almost 100% 911 call generated. And their second question was, okay, then let's see the 911 call data. So they wanted to find out who was calling 911. That's a frightening scenario because that's like a million little fascists running around saying, well, you called 911 and now we're going to target either your business or your home for doing so.
And there's this narrative that's being put forward that is just simply not true. So like in Charlottesville and Fairfax County, we hear frequently that there's this disproportionate use of force on African Americans in Fairfax County. They cite data that's on the government website that shows that 45% of the instances of uses of force occurred in cases with African Americans. But what they don't do is they leave out significant information, such as the fact that 42% of assaults on police officers occurred by African Americans. And furthermore, in a meeting I was in several weeks ago with Supervisor Lusk and the board, it was a public safety meeting. Supervisor Lusk stated there's data that we need to look at from this report, such as the fact that if there are 50 incidents, these were his exact words, 50 incidents involving one single African American, and he or she was arrested 50 times, that would show up, if there were 100 arrests, as 50% targeting of African Americans. So we have to look at that. We have to clean this data. And also the fact that a lot of the arrests in Fairfax County involve individuals from Maryland or D.C. or surrounding areas.
Yeah.
So you can't look at that as just sequestered to Fairfax County residents. And so the data is not representative of what the truth is.
As with most stats, they can be made and parsed to say whatever it is you want them to say. Brenda Tillet, president of Bolster the Blue. Find out more at bolstertheblue.com. Thank you so much, first and foremost, for what you're doing, but also for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you so much, Joe. I would just encourage people, get involved, whatever you can do in your community, and make your voice heard. And thank you so much.
No, not at all. And we'll talk to you again very soon. Good luck on December 1st. And for all of you on the receiving end of the broadcast, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. Until next weekend, so long, and thanks for all the fish.